Hello and welcome to Skyline. I'm Dhruti. Well, tonight we begin with a question. What happens when a war ends, but nobody believes the peace is there? What exactly is happening? Is this the beginning of a historic peace? Or are we simply watching the first chapter of a much bigger geopolitical struggle between the US and Iran? Tonight we connect all the dots because every headline is connected. Every statement matters, and every decision being made today, it could shape the future of the entire West Asia for years to come. So let's start with it. Well, in the first story, can you imagine waking up on a very normal Monday morning? You kiss your family goodbye. Well, you grab your coffee, you head to work. Nothing feels unusual, nothing feels different. And yet, within a few hours, your life is over. That is the tragedy now confronting 8 American families. At Edwards Air Force Base in California, a B-52 bomber, it took off on what officials described as a routine test mission. Nothing extraordinary, nothing unusual, just another day, just another flight. At least that's what everybody thought it would be. And then suddenly something went wrong, rather very wrong. Moments after takeoff, one of the most iconic aircraft in American military history, it crashed. A giant fireball erupted, thick black smoke filled the sky. Emergency vehicles rushed towards the scene, but there was nothing they could do. All 8 crew members on board, they were killed, just like that, all gone. Can you think what that really means? The B-52, it is not some experimental aircraft. It is not a brand new prototype. That aircraft has been flying for generations now. It has survived wars. It has survived military operations around the globe. It has become one of the most recognizable symbols of American military power. Well, for decades, this particular aircraft, the B-52, it has represented strength, reliability and deterrence. Yet on this day, that giant machine, it became a tomb. Investigators, they are now trying to understand what really happened here. Was it mechanical failure, a technical malfunction, human error? Could the crash have been prevented? Nobody knows yet. And unfortunately, answers may take months now. Military officials, they say that the investigations could last maybe 6 months or even longer. 6 months. Imagine being a family member. Imagine waiting 6 months just to learn what happened to your loved ones. Imagine not knowing their final moment. Imagine living with that particular question every single day. Because for families, this is no longer just about military aviation. It's no longer about aircraft technology. It is about loss. It's about grief. It's about people who left homes expecting to return, and they never did. And tragedies like this, it reminds us of something important. Military headlines often focus on equipment, bombers, missiles, aircraft technology, but behind every machine are human beings. People with families, people with dreams, people with plans for their future. And in an instant, all that can disappear. The crash, it is now being described as one of the deadliest B-52 incidents in decades. And as investigators, they begin their work, America is left searching for answers. But yes, while California mourns a devastating military tragedy, another story is creating political shockwaves across the globe. And this one involves Mr. Trump, Iran, and a number so large that it has stunned the observers worldwide. Because while America investigates a deadly crash at home, questions are growing about whether Washington could soon be sending billions of dollars to its former enemy or not. Can you imagine spending months in a conflict, deploying military forces, risking escalation, warning the entire world about security threat, and then suddenly facing accusations that you are preparing to hand billions of dollars to the very country you were fighting? Well, it sounds unbelievable, right? Ladies and gentlemen, yet that is exactly the controversy that is dominating international headlines today. Reports began circulating that a massive reconstruction package, it could be linked to the emerging US-Iran agreement. You know what is the number that is being discussed? $300 billion. Let that sink in. 300 billions. That's what we are talking about. Not millions, billions. Well, that's a huge amount. A figure large enough to rebuild cities, large enough to transform economies, large enough to trigger outrage across political circles here. Well, in the meantime, almost immediately, social media exploded. Critics demanded answers, supporters demanded clarification. Analysts began debating whether such a move it could be politically possible or not. And then came Mr. Trump's response here. That's right, US President, his answer, it was short, it was direct, and it was typical Trump style, unmistakable. Fake news. Yes, two words, fake news. That's typical Trump style. Mr. Trump dismissed reports that America would be handing over hundreds of billions of dollars. Instead, he focused on what he considers the real success of the agreement. Iran's commitment not to pursue nuclear weapon. But here's where things get more and more interesting, because even if the reports are inaccurate, the reaction tells us something very, very important, right? Trust remains incredibly fragile, and specifically during the wartime. Think about it. The mere suggestion that America might financially support Iran, it was enough to spark a global controversy. Ladies and gentlemen, let's know the reason behind it. Why? Why is this such a sensitive issue? Because years of hostility, it cannot disappear overnight. Well, for decades, Washington and Tehran have viewed each other with a lot of suspicion, sanction, threat, military confrontation, proxy conflict. Now, all of that history, it still exists. And that history shapes how people, they interpret every single headline. Supporters of diplomacy, they argue that peace requires compromise. Critics argue that compromise, it can sometimes look like weakness. And that particular debate, it is now becoming one of the biggest political battles surrounding this particular agreement. In the meantime, leaders are emphasizing another political benefit here: the reopening of Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important energy route, basically a waterway through which a lot of amount of oil move every single day. If stability returns there, global energy market, it could benefit. Oil prices could stabilize. In fact, economic uncertainty, it could decrease, and countries around the globe, including India, could feel the effects here. But even as diplomats celebrate progress, not everyone appears convinced here, because while official statement speaks about peace, some Iranian leaders, they are maybe sending a very different message that the world should pay attention to. Basically, a peace agreement is signed. Leaders are shaking hands, photographs are taken, official statements are released, diplomats celebrate, television anchors, they talk about breakthroughs. Everything appears calm, everything appears hopeful, everything appears under control. And then suddenly, an influential Iranian leader, he publicly praises Hezbollah and attacks Israel. Just like that, the mood changes. Questions begin flooding in. Has anything really changed? Is this genuine peace or merely a temporary pause maybe? That is the challenge facing the new agreement, because peace is no longer judged only by signatures. Peace is judged by behavior. Peace is judged by actions. Peace is judged by what leaders say after the cameras leave. Well, the supporters, they argue that diplomacy, it takes time. They say decades of hostility, it cannot disappear overnight. Now, they say expecting immediate trust, that is unrealistic. And perhaps they have a point. But critics see something very different here. They argue that rhetoric matters, word matters, messages matters, because when influential political figures, they continue using very controversial language, doubts naturally appears. Think about that for a moment. If two rivals genuinely want peace, shouldn't their public messages, it begins reflecting that goal? Shouldn't the tone start changing? Shouldn't there be signs of maybe a little bit of friendship? Well, those are the questions many observers are asking today. And those questions do not only matter for America and Iran. It matters for the entire West Asia, because this region, it has seen countless agreements, countless ceasefires, countless diplomatic announcements. Some succeed here, many fail. And the difference was often trust. And right now, trust remains in short supply. That is why the world is watching so carefully. Not just the agreement itself, but everything happening around it. Every statement, every speech, every social media post, every signal, because sometimes the most important part of a peace agreement, it is not what is written on the paper, it is what happens after the ink dries. And yes, already another controversy is emerging, one that involves satellite images, military technology, and a claim that could dramatically reshape perception of the recent conflict. Did Iran actually damage a key American military asset? That's where we go next. Satellite images, one bloody picture, and suddenly the internet explodes. Did Iran destroy a key American radar system? Was a critical military asset knocked out during retaliatory strike? Or is this simply online speculation? Well, the radar in question plays a major role in air surveillance. It helped detect threat, track the aircraft, provide early warning. If it was damaged, that would be significant. And if it wasn't, the rumor themselves, it start revealing something important. Can you think how modern conflict really works? A few decades ago, military battles, they were fought mainly on land, in air, or maybe at sea. Today, there is another battlefield: information. In fact, images, narrative, and social media. A single satellite photo, it can travel around the globe in a minute. A single claim, it can dominate headlines before governments even have time to verify the facts. And that is exactly what appears to be happening here. Supporters of the claim, they argue that the images reveal serious damage. In fact, skeptics argue that conclusions are being drawn too quickly here. Military experts, they are urging caution. In fact, intelligence analysts, they are looking for more evidence, and ordinary people are left wondering what is true and what is not. Because in today's world, perception can be almost as powerful as reality. Governments do understand this, militaries do understand this, and increasingly the public is learning it too. Whether the radar it was truly damaged or not, the whole controversy itself, it tells us something important. The Iran and the US conflict, it may be cooling diplomatically, but the information war, that is very much alive. And as long as competing narrative, it continues spreading online, every image, every video, and every rumor, it will be examined through a political lens. But now here are the emotions running higher than in Israel. Because while Washington talks about diplomacy, many Israelis believe that something very different is happening. Imagine fighting a war, making sacrifices, accepting risk. In fact, watching soldiers leave their home, watching families live under constant threat of missiles, watching businesses close, watching communities adapt to uncertainty, and then suddenly seeing your closest ally negotiating with the very country you believed threatened your security. Well, that is exactly how many Israelis feel today. Across Israel, criticism is growing louder. Politicians, they are, and that too from different parties, they are fighting. Former military officials, security experts, television commentators, ordinary citizens, many of them, they are asking the same question. Was all of this even worth it? For months, Israeli leaders, they argued that Iran represented one of the biggest threats to the country's security. They defended military operation. They justified the risks. In fact, they told the public that difficult decisions were necessary. They argued that pressure would weaken Iran's influence across the region here. But now many Israelis, they are looking at the US-Iran agreement and wondering whether those sacrifices achieve their intended goal or not. Here, some believe that the government gives Iran valuable breathing room. Others fear sanction relief could strengthen Tehran economically. Many worry the diplomacy is replacing pressure at exactly the wrong moment. And perhaps the biggest concern is uncertainty. Israeli wants to know what happens next. They want to know whether Iran's behavior, it will actually change. They want to know whether the agreement will make the region safer or simply delay future confrontations. The result is growing frustration. And increasingly, that frustration is being directed at Israel's own leadership. Because as public anger grows, one man finds himself standing directly in the center of the storm. Well, Benjamin Netanyahu. He has spent much of his political career representing himself as a guardian of Israeli security. For years, he warned about Iran. For years, he argued that Tehran's ambitions posed a serious threat here. And for years, many Israelis, they trusted his judgment. Well, however, today, that trust is being tested. Critics are asking difficult questions that did Mr. Netanyahu correctly understand Mr. Trump's strategy? Did he assume Washington would maintain pressure for long? Did Israel become too dependent on American support? And most importantly, did the conflict ultimately strengthen Iran instead of weakening it? Opposition leaders, they have seized the moment, though. Former officials, they are openly criticizing government decisions. In fact, political rivals, they are portraying the agreement as an evidence of strategic failure. Here some say that Mr. Netanyahu promised outcomes that he could not deliver. Others argue that he underestimated how quickly diplomacy could replace military action. In the meantime, elections are approaching. That means every development it is being viewed through both security lens and the political lens. Every statement is analyzed, every decision is scrutinized, every mistake it becomes a potential campaign issue. Now, for Mr. Netanyahu, this may become one of the most difficult chapters of his leadership because when uncertainty grows, voters start asking tough questions. And when expectations are not met, political consequences often follow. Yet, behind all these headlines about Washington and Tehran, another fascinating story it is beginning to emerge. Because what if the real power brokers behind this agreement, they were not in Washington or Tehran at all? When people think about Iran deal, they usually think about Washington or Tehran. Maybe they think about Israel, maybe they think about Europe. But what if some of the most important conversations happened elsewhere? According to Mr. Trump, both Vladimir Putin and Mr. Xi Jinping, they played significant roles behind the scene. Their involvement may not have dominated the headlines though, but it appears to have influenced the diplomacy process. That's right, think about that for a moment here. Russia, China, America, Iran. 4 major superpowers, 4 governments with very different interests. Yet, all of them connected to the same negotiations. Mr. Trump praised Mr. Xi Jinping for helping avoid further escalation. He also credited Mr. Vladimir Putin for maintaining communication channels and encouraging de-escalation. Whether one agrees with these leaders or not, their involvement highlights a larger reality here. The modern world, it is deeply interconnected. Major conflicts are no longer solved by one country acting alone. Instead, they increasingly require multiple powers working together, even when they disagree on many other issues. And that is what makes the whole story so fascinating. The Iran agreement may not simply be a deal between Washington and Tehran. It may represent a much broader diplomatic effort involving some of the most powerful leaders on the planet Earth. And if that is true, its impact could expand far beyond the whole West Asia. But even after all the negotiations, all the meeting and all the agreement, one problem refuses to disappear. That problem is trust. The war may be ending, the agreement may be signed, the diplomats may be smiling, but trust remains missing here. Well, Iran's leaders, they have made that particular thing very, very clear. Ladies and gentlemen, even while discussing the coordination with Washington, Iranian leaders, they kind of continued to express deep skepticism about American interest here. Well, they argued that decades of tension, sanction, military pressure, political disputes cannot simply be forgotten overnight. And from their perspective, trust may be earned. That is why Iranian officials continue to speak very cautiously. They support reducing tension though, they support moving forward, but they also repeatedly remind the world that they maintain wary of the American promises here. At the very same time, Iran has announced plans to charge service fees in the Strait of Hormuz. Officials insist that these are not any transit tolls. Instead, they describe them as charges related to navigation service, environmental protection, insurance, and maritime support. Why this matters? Rather, this matters a lot because the Strait of Hormuz, that is one of the most important waterway on the planet Earth. In fact, a significant share of global oil shipment, it passes through it. So any disruption, it can affect energy prices. Any uncertainty can affect markets, and any major change, it can eventually affect customers around the globe. Which basically means this agreement, it is not just about politics, it's about economics, it's about trade, it's about energy security. And that brings us to perhaps the most important question of all. Can this particular deal actually work? In the meantime, sometimes the most honest answer is also the simplest. We don't know. That is essentially the message coming from the United States Vice President, Mr. J.D. Vance. Can America be completely certain that Iran will follow through on every promise? No. Can anybody guarantee that future disagreements will not emerge? No. Can anybody predict exactly what will happen months or years from now? Again, no. And that honesty, it may be one of the most important parts of the entire story. Because despite all the headlines, this agreement, it is not built on trust. It's built on verification, it's built on inspections, it is built on monitoring, it is built on the idea that promises must be checked, tested, and confirmed. According to reports, Iran would need to meet strict requirements before receiving major benefits. International inspectors, they would play a central role here. Compliance would matter, verification would matter. In other words, this agreement, it is not based on faith, it is based on accountability. Yet, even accountability cannot eliminate uncertainty completely, right? Ladies and gentlemen, that is why Mr. J.D. Vance is warning it matters. He reminded the world that diplomacy, it always involves risk. Agreements can succeed, agreements can fail, and sometimes they do a little of both of the things. For now, the world waits, waiting to see whether promises become action, waiting to see whether tensions continue falling, and waiting to see whether this agreement it becomes a historic breakthrough or simply another temporary pause in a conflict that has changed the entire West Asia for decades. Well, tonight we followed a story that began with tragedy and ended with uncertainty. A deadly crash in California, a controversial agreement between the US and Iran, questions about billions of dollars, Iranian leaders sending mixed signals, satellite images, raising military concern. In fact, Israeli anger, Netanyahu under pressure, Russia and China stepping into diplomatic spotlight, Iran's continuing mistrust of America, and finally, a warning from America's own vice president that nobody can predict the world with the complete certainty. Because in international politics, peace is not a destination, a fragile process, one that requires trust, verification, patience, and sometimes a little luck. The headlines may change tomorrow, new developments may emerge, new tensions may arise, but tonight, central question remains. Has the whole West Asia truly turned a corner, or is this simply the calm before the another storm? Well, only time will tell. Thank you for joining me on Skyline. I'm Dhriti Athri. Stay informed, stay cautious, and remember, behind every headline is a bigger story. I'll see you in the next episode.